just about sailing. There's a whole bunch of words and a whole bunch of details about how to sail a boat and the struggles of it and things. And it's just kind of a really interesting chapter to read. And I would encourage you to go and just read the whole chapter on your own. We're going to run through the chapter this morning. I'll skip through quite a bit of it because I'd like to get to chapter number 28 to make a point for us to learn from this morning. But Acts chapter number 27, look at verse number 1. The Bible says, "And it was determined that we should sail into Italy. Then delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus' band." And this guy was really good to Paul. He was kind to him, and he allowed Paul to go into some of his friends and to find comfort. And he was kind to the Apostle Paul. But Paul gets on this boat, and they're going to Italy. But they're going to run into all kinds of problems. Look at verse number 4. "And when we had launched from thence, we sailed unto Cyprus, under Cyprus, because the winds were contrary." So as soon as they start this journey, the winds are not going the right way. It'd be like trying to drive a car, and you're trying to go in drive, and your car only goes in reverse. And all of a sudden, you try to back up and just back up where you're going, and now it only goes in drive. You know, you're only able to go the wrong way. And that's where they're at. The winds are contrary, and they're in a sailboat, so there's only so much you can do if the winds aren't doing what they're supposed to do. But that's verse number 4, and it's already starting out really rough. Verse number 6. "And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing unto Italy, and he put us therein. And when we had sailed slowly many days, and scarce were come over against, I call that Nidus or Sidus, I don't know how you say it, C and an N together, but Nidus, because the wind not suffering us, we sailed unto Crete, over against Salmon." And if you were to look at a map, and you were to see that they've spent many days now, the wind is contrary, and they're going slow, and many days, if you look at a map, and you're just looking at the Mediterranean Sea, it's like this. There's barely anything. They've barely moved. And so they get out, the winds are contrary, now that it's slow going, and they get off this boat to get into a bigger boat, and they're just running into more problems. Look at verse number 9. The Bible says in verse number 9, "Now when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them, and said to them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only for the lading of the ship, but also of our lives. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than these things which were spoken by Paul." And so God's always given Paul really, really good perspective on things. And he's always had really good wisdom. And Paul, he says, we should not go now. And they say, yeah, let's go now. And he's running into nothing but problems. And so it's gone from the winds being contrary to really slow going many days and barely moving, to now it's dangerous and you're going to lose the ship and maybe even lose lives. Look at verse number 13. "And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind, called Euroclydon. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. And running under a certain island, which is called Clauda, which had much work to come by the boat." So now they finally get a wind that seems to be going the right direction. They say, okay, this is our chance. So they jump into this nice slow wind, and as soon as they start going, it becomes violent again. And it was so violent that the only thing they could do was point the boat downwind and just let the wind take them where the wind wants to take them, because there was no fighting against this wind. So they end up off course again. And so you look and you see this entire journey is taking a whole long time here and a whole long time there, and they're waiting, and now they're thrown way off course. But they left just to go do this thing, just to end up in Italy. And it should have been a simple thing. And now days and days and days have gone, and then weeks go by. And now all of a sudden they're not any farther than they were when they started. And as you go through this chapter, they begin looking and saying, winter time is coming. So now not only are they not getting to where they're going, they're looking for a place to get to that they can just be safe for the winter. Imagine trying to take a journey, and all of a sudden the seasons are changing, and you're just going to move someplace for a year because you just need to get someplace. Well, that's something. It's a much different world than what we live in today. I remember we left Maryland, and Maryland's a 2-day trip back. And we came, and then the storm was coming, so we got a hotel in Portage, Indiana. And then we got up early the next day and drove all day the next day and got a hotel just on the other side of Chicago. It's only about an hour and a half drive when there's no weather or when there's no traffic. And we just sat there all day long. You could see the Sears Tower. It's the Willis Tower now, but you could see the Sears Tower. He just sat there, and nobody was moving. And we even shut the car off to conserve gas. And then all of a sudden, the stuff would start moving, so you'd fire the car back up, and you'd drive 10 yards, sit there, put it in park, and have conversation, messing around in the back seat. And, oh, the car is moving. It's the worst thing. But it's nothing compared to getting on a boat and then months and months later being closer to where you started than where you're going, and the whole thing being dangerous, and everybody's starving and everybody's hungry, and all the resources that they've got, they're dumping off the boat to try and save themselves. But it's a rough deal. As we go on, look at verse number 20. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. So now they're out in the sea. They're just floating around. The wind is taking them wherever the wind wants to go. And it's not a little bit of wind. It's a lot of wind. And every time they try to get their bearing and try to figure out where they're supposed to go, they look up, and there's no stars because it's cloud cover. And then in the daytime, there's no sun. It's behind the clouds. And they go many days this way, hungry. And they're going 14 days now without any food. There's nothing to eat. Look at verse number 21. But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and not have loosed from Crete, and have gained this harm and loss. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. For there stood by me this night an angel of God, whose I am. Now, if you were to read through the Gospels, it's interesting. To me, I've taught a lesson before about the different types of angels. We talk about seraphim and cherubim, ruling angels, ministering spirits. Then I talk about guardian angels. And if you were to read through the Gospels, a couple different times, Jesus talks about their angels. I think that's a really interesting thing. And I believe that I have guardian angels over me. And I believe that you all have guardian angels over you. Then there's angels that are your angels that have charge and rule in your life and help with different things. And there's all kinds of stories about car accidents. There's all kinds of car accidents and things where people give testimony of miraculous things happening or close calls and things. And I would believe that can be accredited to guardian angels. And here Paul, he says, well, my angel came to me last night. And it's kind of an interesting thing there. But he makes that statement. There stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am, and whom I serve, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. And so he is able to go to them in verse number 36. And he says, Then were they all of good cheer, and they also took some meat, and we were all in the ship 216 souls. That's a lot of people. So we've got hundreds of people in this boat, and they've all been scared. And if you were to read through much of the rest of the chapter, they're casting all this stuff out. They're dumping all their belongings over the side of this boat to try and make it as light as they can, and so they don't sink. And all this, and they've got all these really bad days behind them. The angel comes and gives comfort to Paul, and Paul is able to then comfort the people that are around him. And there's hundreds of people here who are now happy to be on this boat. And it goes on. And when they had eaten enough, they lighted the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. And look at verse number 41. And falling into a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the forepart struck fast and remained unmovable, and the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. So now they are shipwrecked. They drove the front of the boat into the shoreline, and the back of the boat's all busted off now. So they're shipwrecked on this island. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that they which could swim cast themselves first into the sea and get to land, and the rest some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass there escaped all safe to land. So if you can imagine crashing into this island, and you're still a long ways away, you just hitting the bottom of the ocean. And so all these, and it's a big ship, because there's hundreds of people on this ship. It's a great big shipwreck. The back of the ship's been busted off, and so there's boards all over in the water. And if you can swim, you just swim to shore. And if you can't, you jump on a broken piece of boat and you get to shore. So now imagine getting onto this island, and all of this stuff now has happened. I would be stressed out. I would be discouraged. I'd be looking around thinking, God, you said I was going to get to Italy. You said I'd be safe and all these things. And now you're stranded on an island. And we're going to see here as we get to chapter number 28, he shows up, and then they identify what island it is, and it's full of barbarian people, the Bible is going to say. And I want to take a lesson from these guys. And now we've kind of gone through chapter 27. We see Paul going through this very difficult time of shipwreck. But now I want to take our perspective and switch it a little bit. And now imagine we are these people that are already on this island and see the judgment that comes. Acts 28, look at verse number 1. And I'm going to slow down now and take a little bit more time through these passages. But Acts 28 and verse number 1. And when they were escaped, then they knew that the island was called Melita. And the barbarous people showed us no little kindness. And I know I've said it before, but when I read that, it sounds like they didn't even receive a little bit of kindness. But that's not what God means. And God uses that language in the King James Bible. No little kindness means they were shown kindness, and it wasn't a little bit of kindness. It was a lot of kindness. Much like when he says it wasn't no little wind, and then the whole boat is destroyed. Because it wasn't a little wind, it was a lot of wind. And so they find these people and they show a lot of kindness. They're very kind to these people. And the barbarous people showed us no little kindness, for they kindled a fire and received us every one because of the present rain and because of the cold. And so they find this group of people, and they're not religious people, they're not Christian people, but they find a group of people who just received them. And I think that's an interesting thing, because if the church would have the same kind of testimony as the barbarians here on this island, the church would be huge. The church would find all kinds of success. But we've got to challenge ourselves a little bit more than what we do. We've got to be a group of people who is receptive and able to bring them in. But we look, and now we see things change a little bit in verse number 3. We see the perspective that comes. Verse number 3, and when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, there came a viper out of the heat and fastened on his hand. And when the barbarians saw the venomous beast hang on his hand, they said among themselves, no doubt this man is a murderer, whom though he hath escaped the sea, yet vengeance suffereth not to live. Remember when Job, if you were to read Job chapter number 4, all the way to Job, I think, chapter number 26, he's got his friends with him. And Job hasn't done anything wrong. Job's done everything right. But his friends show up and say, you know what? Everybody who sows iniquity or plows iniquity and sows unrighteousness, well, they reap from that. And so they're looking at Job's life and saying, you've got some sin in your life. And he goes, well, I'm looking at my life. I don't see any sin in my life. I'm looking for it, and I just can't find the wrongdoing. And this is like, well, maybe you're prideful. Maybe you've been arrogant. Maybe you've been dishonest. Maybe you've cheated something. Maybe you've stolen. They just go right down the list. And miserable comforters were they. And so we look and we see it's natural for mankind. So Job experienced that. Paul is seeing this here. And so you got this whole group of people. Now they were receptive and they brought people in. But as soon as something bad happened, they said, this guy must be a murderer. Now, there is really no reason for them to think that. They just saw that he survived the ocean, and now he's got this beast on him. And so, fate's going to get him no matter what happens. He escaped one, we're going to get him another way. And so they just assumed he's a murderer. So we go on. It says, whom, though he hath escaped the sea, yet vengeance suffereth not to live. You remember Jesus, he said there's going to be a time when his disciples, they could be bit by serpents and they would live. They could be burned with fire and they wouldn't be affected by that. And there was the idea of being protected by some different things. And I believe we see that come to fruition here. But look at verse number 5. And he shook off the beast into the fire and felt no harm. Howbeit they looked when he should have swollen or fallen down dead suddenly. But after they had looked a great while and saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. So they're all over the place. And so they look and they see this guy. He's bit by a snake, and they're the natives on this land. This is their island. They own this island. They know what's going on. And so that snake that bit Paul, they knew this snake kills people. And when we see somebody get bit by this snake, it's supposed to swell up, and they're supposed to fall down dead suddenly. That's what's supposed to happen. Just like we went out to Mount Rushmore this summer, took Jason and Cassandra out there. They'd never been out to the Black Hills or anything. It was funny because he went out there, and he was expecting Mount Rushmore to be barely bigger than the pulpit. Like, I think he was expecting something really small. And he got out there, and he was like, whoa, that's way bigger than he thought it was going to be. Then we went through Needles Highway, and we got to see the Black Hills, and he said, okay, South Dakota does have something, he said, but he thought it was really lame, like this tiny little statue we were going to go look at. So that was way different than what I expected. But anyway, we were out there walking the Badlands, and there were these trails, and there were all these signs that said rattlesnakes and stay on the trail. Well, being from South Dakota, you can look at a rattlesnake, you can identify it, you know the danger that's there, it starts to make that noise, you know that snake. Well, there'd be people around the world, if they'd never heard of a rattlesnake and show up, and they wouldn't know just how dangerous that would be. But these guys, they know what happens when this snake bites people. And so they look, and they, right away, they know this guy's going to be dead. And they say, he must be a murderer. And then all of a sudden, he doesn't die, and they say, he must be a god. This guy must be a god. And they begin to desire to worship the Apostle Paul. How quickly the crowd can change on some things. And I would caution us against that. We look and even in our society, you look and you have somebody who has money. And there's a whole segment of society that looks at somebody who has money, and boy, they born with a silver spoon in their mouth, and boy, dad must have really given them something, and they've been spoiled in life. Or people will oftentimes think, what did they do? They must have cheated to get that. Must have stole something. They must have done these things to get ahead, or somebody's in position of leadership, and what did they do to get into that spot? And there's a judgment that tends to come. We got to be careful with that. Oftentimes people have what they have because they just work really hard. You know, there's always situations where you've got a boss that maybe is definitely not qualified, but he's the brother of the guy who's in charge of making him your boss. There's always different things that go on. But we have a society and a tendency to look at something and we judge quite harshly. Got to be careful with that. Sometimes you see somebody who doesn't have money, and the judgment that comes, somebody who doesn't have money. And we really tend to pick on people way more than what we ought to. We look and we see Paul, there was a criticism, then there was a praise. Neither one of them was justified. Neither one of them. He wasn't a murderer, he wasn't a god. But everybody fell for it, and everybody, that's where their mind went. And Paul had to go and correct those things. When people walk through our doors and they come into our ministry, it doesn't matter what they look like. It doesn't matter what their history seems to be or what the perspective of our church on that person is based on how they look or what they seem to be. We've got to be careful when it comes to making a judgment about who we come into contact with. You go to a store and somebody is unkind to you when you're trying to give them their money and they're rude to you behind the counter. It's really easy to come to all kinds of conclusions and think that just must be some jerky guy. I can tell you there's been times in my life where the situation in my life causes me to behave a certain way. There was this tree. I just bought this flip house. It was my second investment house in Missouri. And there was this great big tree outside. And these neighbor kids, since this house had been vacant for a while, I bought a foreclosure. And it was just a disaster. The yard was a jungle. And I planted all this grass seed, and I trimmed this tree way up and all this. And after I trimmed that tree up, you go out there to these branches. And once you trim up, you just got these nice little handles that go all the way up. So the neighbor kids who were used to just playing in this yard and running all around this house would still come over and play in these trees and things. And I went out there, and these kids were up in the tree. And I said, "Hey, get out of the tree." And I'm not a mean guy, but I came out and I said, "Get out of my tree. I already told you to get out of the tree." Then I go back inside, and then I'm down in the basement. We're putting this metal. The basement was kind of goofy, so we put a metal roof on top, just tin on the top, and we're just going for a rugged, more man look. And the basement turned out really well. It was like a pool. It's for like a pool table area. And I look out this egress window, and I see those kids halfway up the tree again. And I threw my stuff down, and I walked out into the front yard, and I said, "Hey, get out of my tree." And they said, "We're not going to fall." And I said, "Get out of that tree now." I said, "If you don't get out of that tree, you're going to die." And I said it like I'm going to go kill them, right? So you get out of that tree or you're going to die. And I was implying like you could fall and get hurt, but I said it in such a way like, "I will kill you if you don't." And so I wanted them to leave, and they did, and they never came back. And that's not usually how I behave. But it was that morning I went and I did airsoft that day at a birthday party with some friends. And it was that day that I got a text. It is that day that my grandpa had passed away. And so that was back 2015. My grandpa passed away that day. My grandpa was my favorite person in the whole world. And so I made some plans. I was talking to the guy I had hired and a couple of the guys, and I was there just trying to give them instructions on the next things that need to do. And I said, "I'm going to be gone." And so we're down there in this basement. We're working on these things, trying to get everything set up so I can disappear for a while, because I came up here and preached a funeral for my grandpa. But I remember that day, if you want to be the kids climbing in my tree, all of a sudden I'm the grumpy 65-year-old guy that runs outside and yells at you for being in the lawn. And I went back inside, and I tell that story now like it's funny, but I went in and I felt so bad for yelling at these kids that way. And I just felt like I threatened them with death. But I went out there and I was mean. And I came in and Jason was there, Danny Burks was there, I think, and I just said, "I feel really bad." And then we all had this big laugh about it because it was kind of funny. But boy, I felt bad. And you look and you can examine in your own lives. Sometimes you'll run into people, and it's really easy to come to a judgment about somebody, but you don't know what happened. You talk to somebody who's very unkind to you or very short with you, and you don't know what's going on at home. You don't know what's going on with their kids. You don't know what's going on with their finances. You don't know what's going on with their older parents or their grandparents, or even what's going on even within themselves. Maybe they went to the doctor the other day, and their whole world has fallen apart. But when you look and you see somebody in a situation, you only know them for a moment. These people didn't know Paul. Paul came in as some shipwrecked guy. He just went and grabbed some sticks, threw it in the fire, and all of a sudden they're like, "Murderer. We know it. This guy's a murderer." He's not a murderer. Well, he was. Jesus fixed him up. But they came down with a judgment. And then they went the exact opposite way. And they judged him wrongly a second time when he didn't die. Just be careful about that. People will come into this place. You got to be careful with our judgments. You go out into the world and at work or family reunions or school or whatever you've got going on, let's be more gentle than what we are. Even people go on Facebook and they'll post things and you think, "That's the stupidest thing." And boy, we just start these spiral out of control Facebook fights for no reason. It's one of the dumbest things, a Facebook fight. But you don't realize the hurt that somebody can experience. You don't know those things. So let's slow way down and say, okay, Paul wasn't the bad guy. Paul also wasn't a god. the judgment was wrong. I'm not usually the guy that's going to go and scream at kids out in the front yard and threaten them with death for being in my tree, but I did that. You talk to people and they treat you the wrong way. Try to have a little bit more patience, which is our lesson for today. Patience, adding patience to our temperance this morning. Let's be a little bit slower to that. Think things through. Because I'm sure there's not a person here who can't say, I've also had a bad day. And if you've had a bad day and you've gotten through that bad day, we ought to be able to give other people the same kind of grace to have a bad day. And I'm out of time. Let's go to a prayer this morning. We will be dismissed. Lord, I love you. Thank you for the opportunity to be in Sunday school. Lord, I just pray you bless the service that's coming. Help us to, with wisdom, be able to add to our faith. Pray it be a challenge to us. And Lord, as we look and we see this judgment against Paul, wrong both directions, Lord, I pray that we would be a group of people and we'd be individuals within our families, our workplace, our community, where we would be slower to cast out a judgment, kind of like Job's friends. Lord, every one of us can have good days. We can all have bad days. We can all have easy times and hard times. Lord, I pray that we'd give that same kind of grace to those that are around us. Lord, we love you. In Jesus' name, amen. You are dismissed this morning.